ALCTS Continuing Education Committee webinar for the RDA Open Forum Ask the Experts. I'm Janet Arberg, your host and a member of the committee. The experts joining us today to address the questions on RDA are Erin Stalberg, who is the head of metadata and cataloging at North Carolina State University Libraries, where she leads the department of 20 staff members in the library's cataloging and metadata initiatives. The department is responsible for the cataloging of materials of all formats and in all languages, both in MARC and in non-MARC schema. NCSU was a participant in the U.S. National Library's RDA test. Erin also teaches organization of materials as an adjunct at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Information and Library Science. Next is Trina Grover, who is head of cataloging at the Ryerson University Library in Toronto. She has designed and delivered cataloging workshops in the USA for the Mark of Quality and for various colleges and associations in Canada. She is a member of the Canadian Committee on MARC. Trina is collaborating with librarians across the country to create resources to help Canadian libraries implement RDA. Next is Kathryn Barre, who is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Graduate School of Library and Information Science. She served as the coordinator for the GSLIS RDA test practicum. She also teaches and does research in the area of information organization with a particular focus on the use of facets in next-generation catalogs. And then we have Linda Gabel, who has worked at OCLC since 1984 in a variety of areas, including OCLC contract cataloging and most recently in WorldCat quality management, coordinating the OCLC contract cataloging RDA testing. Among the projects she has worked on are connection product management, format integration, phase 2, the development of CAT Express service, and the introduction of the e-serials holding service. Linda has also served on several ALA committees, particularly for ALCTS. Now, before we begin, please note this session will be recorded and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the experts' PowerPoint slides. Another announcement is that the source of today's questions came from an open survey. These questions were then categorized, with some of the questions being combined because of length and for clarity. We'll start the questions for the categories beginning with transcriptions, followed by descriptions and authority control, conflicts with existing guidelines, testing and training, the future of RDA, vendors, and the RDA toolkit. And today we have approximately 1,000 registered attendees joining us for a 75-minute webinar. And because of the large number of attendees and the time constraint, the experts will not be able to answer any additional questions during today's sessions. However, you may submit questions by typing them into the question box on your screen. These questions will be collected, and as many as possible will be answered later by the experts posted on the ALCTS CE website. These questions may also be used for future RDA webinars. Now, let's start with the questions. Trina will be the expert answering all of the questions regarding the first category on transcriptions. Now, the first question is, are the ISBD 8 areas of description in RDA, and is ISBD punctuation used in RDA? Trina?
Hello, everyone. Okay, as for ISBD, it's important to remember that in RDA we are thinking about data elements as separate things and not as part of areas. So the concept of 8 areas of description is not used in RDA. However, information on presenting descriptions built with RDA in an ISP display, information about that is in Appendix D. It's in an appendix because it is temporarily useful to us while we're still coding MARC records. From now on, I'm going to refer to AACR2 as A2, just so I don't stutter over the whole acronym. And I want to repeat, you probably heard this analogy before, but I find this is a good analogy. It's helped me understand what's going on. And the analogy is that we should think of A2 like a stone cottage, a stone building that was expertly built a long time ago. What we have with RDA is we've taken that stone cottage and dismantled it. The stones have been, in some cases, altered and polished, and in every case they've been repurposed and combined with new stones and then built into a completely different framework. So we can recognize many of the elements that we've been working with in the ISBD world, but in RDA they are significantly changed. So again, Appendix D is important when you're thinking about ISBD. It shows us how RDA elements map with ISBD and what punctuation to use. And while we're working in the MARC environment, we'll continue to enter RDA elements in what is in effect the ISBD areas, because that's how the MARC fields are structured. But once we start using RDA outside of MARC, we'll have to stop thinking about these elements as being parts of areas and stop thinking of them as going into particular MARC tags. And it's for this reason that I would not encourage people to simply annotate their copies of A2 to note the changes for RDA. We have to think in RDA speak and think in the RDA framework if we're going to learn how to use it properly. And you cannot think in the RDA way if you are looking at A2. So on to the next question.
Okay. Can you explain why RDA is inconsistent with abbreviations?
Okay, abbreviations. There is a significant change regarding abbreviations. Pretty much, well, a lot of them are gone, but a few abbreviations do remain in RDA. Latin abbreviations are gone, and abbreviations in general are used much less frequency. A2 called for abbreviations in transcribed fields when the abbreviations weren't even there on the source of information. For example, we abbreviated the edition statement regardless of how it appeared, and we abbreviated the publisher's name. RDA is more consistent in its use of abbreviations, I think, because when it comes to transcription, we never introduce abbreviations. We always take what we see on the resource. When recording data for other elements that do not require transcription, there are a few instances in RDA where you can use abbreviations. And then there's the metric symbols. I think some of the confusion about abbreviations comes from the fact that, as RDA states, metric symbols are not abbreviations. And so, for example, the symbol for centimeters is lowercase letters C and M, which looks suspiciously like an abbreviation, but in fact, CM is a symbol. For Americans who will use non-metric measurements, you will get to use more abbreviations. Some units of time and non-metric units of measurements are data where you can use abbreviations in RDA, and that might be why there's this sense of inconsistency. Appendix B is where you're going to look for information about abbreviations in RDA, and it does have a lot to say about abbreviations. It's pretty long. But the actual list of abbreviations that we're going to use is much shorter than the A2 list. It's narrowed down to only the most commonly used terms. So we're definitely not going to be abbreviating the word edition anymore, or editor. So our RDA's kept, the really well-known abbreviations in there, but removed many of those that are considered, ambiguous or library-specific. It's worth noting that the vision that people have for the platforms we're going to be using in the future, the modules, the cataloging modules that we're going to be using, those will hopefully be designed to make the work of entering data simpler. They should include things like drop-down lists from which we can choose so that you won't have to remember all the abbreviations that you are and are not going to use. So in the meantime, we're just going to have to create, instructions for ourselves and maybe some cheat sheets so that we can keep those abbreviations straight and perhaps add them to the workflows in the toolkit, which I think would be ideal. But I think the basic, a very important thing to remember is that metric symbols are not abbreviations. They're symbols. And I hope that answers the question.
Okay, next question. Since an RDA, all creators are treated as equal access points, why differentiate between main and added entries?
All right, I'm going to start off by reading 2 brief sentences to you from the RDA prospectus. The prospectus was a blurb that was created before the tool was published, before the content of the instructions were published, in an attempt to, explain the rationale and sort of the vision for RDA. Okay, so it says the concept of main entry as used in a card catalog is no longer applicable in online catalogs, and this term will not be used in RDA. Nevertheless, there is still a need to choose a preferred access point for a work or expression in order to create bibliographic citations and also to collocate works and expressions in the catalog. So what we have in RDA is basically the concept of main entry is gone, and it's been replaced by something called authorized access points representing works and expressions. Authorized access points representing works and expressions. And we find information about this in Chapter 5.5. The purpose of these authorized access points is to uniquely identify a work or an expression in a human-readable form. RDA 5.5 tells us to construct the access point representing a work by combining the access point for the person with the preferred title for the work. So the authorized access point for a work or expression is going to identify the work. It's what we're going to use to identify a work, and we can't use the title alone. We need to have a name plus a title, which means we have to choose one name. And if there are 10 people noted as creators of a work, we can't use all 10 names. We have to choose one. So for now, while we're working in the MARC environment, we'll choose one name and we'll put that name in field 100 because we're still stuck in MARC. How it will be marked up in the new way is yet to be seen. I hope that answers the question. Oh, okay, actually I want to say one more thing. Then my point is that in RDA we do not differentiate between main and added entries, but in the MARC environment it looks like we still are because we're coding them as in MARC. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, next question, number 4. Publication date and copyright dates are separate elements in RDA, but if they are the same date, should we code them in the type of date and publication status field as T?
All right, the short answer is yes. If your publication and copyright dates are exactly the same, you would code the date status field in 008 as T, which indicates publication and copyright dates are included in the record. RDA 2.11 instructs catalogers to enter the symbol for copyright unless they are unable to do that in their system. So in subfield $C of 260, you would include the copyright date with the C in a circle, the symbol, Or you would spell out the word copyright. You would not put the date in square brackets. It's worth noting here that copyright date is not a core element. It is core if. Copyright is core if other dates are not available. But the Library of Congress policy statement instructs us to include both publication and copyright dates when they are available, because copyright dates are important information for us to record for data rights management purposes, and they're just generally useful information that we want to provide. LC even recommends to use it as a guest date if you have a copyright date on the piece but you don't have a publication date. The last thing I want to comment on this is that at the recent Marby meeting at ALA Midwinter, a discussion paper was submitted that proposed a number of ways to encode copyright dates in the MARC record separate from publication dates. Right now, we have to put copyright dates in subfield C with publication dates, and that's a problem. So that discussion paper was discussed, and we expect this to come back as a proposal with specific coding options that allow us to code copyright dates separate from publication dates, and I think this is a good thing. It will separate this element in people's minds because it is a separate element in RDA, so stay tuned.
Okay, question number 5. For non-English items, if the original language is going to be used for cataloging, is Romanization a thing of the past?
Okay, Romanization. RDA allows transliteration, but you will not find the word Romanization in RDA. The word transliteration was chosen as the term in order to move away from the Anglo-American bias. Since the word Romanization kind of refers to changing a non-Latin script to a Latin script. So Romanization is there, but it's not called Romanization, it's called transliteration. In Section 1, Chapter 1.4 of RDA says, record the elements listed in the language and script in which they appear on the source from which they're taken. It's followed by an alternative that says if an element cannot be recorded in the script used on the source, record it in a transliterated form, and that's followed by an optional addition to record a transliterated form in addition to transcribing what's on the piece. So again, RDA does include an alternative to give a transliterated form in the following chapters. In Chapter 1.4, for those elements transcribed, in Chapter 5.4 for titles of works, and in Chapter 8.4 for names. The choice for applying the alternatives is a local decision and could be based on what your library system can do, what your library users need and want, on the language of your catalog, and also, very importantly, on the amount of time needed to provide parallel fields and available staff to do this. Many of us can't do scripts in our systems, so we'll continue with transliteration in all cases. And also many of us don't have the staff with language skills to be able to work in other scripts anyways. So I'm rambling on here, but the short answer is yes, Romanization is there. It's just called transliteration. And I think it's just important to note that this is a pretty complicated decision. You know, even if you can input the characters, you have to consider what your system can index and searching issues for your users, and also thinking about access points and how those are going to display and how people are going to search. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, question number 6. The staff and patrons in our public library are accustomed to using Subfield H in the 245 field to narrow search results. We are very concerned about the subfield going away and the information being transferred to the new 3XX fields. Is elimination of the subfield H an optional change, at least until systems are able to display the new 3XX fields more prominently?
All right, well, I often say to catalogers at Ryerson that there are no cataloging police and we can do whatever we like with our records. But I say that, you know, acknowledging that we have to pay attention to what we're doing when we're batching our records to the Library and Archives of Canada and also to OCLC. You know, if we're going to do some creative cataloging, we have to keep that in mind when we're batching, that we don't want to send those. So that was just an aside. Personally, I really don't think those fields are meant to display anyway, and when I do workshops in Canada, I always recommend that people leave them in there, but the display of them is not an urgent thing right now. We really need to wait for our systems to come up with a way to display them intelligently. In some systems, we just display it, but in some it's indexed. Subfield H of 245 is indexed to separate books from audiobooks and other materials in a title browse, and it also might be useful in brief displays, making it easy to see what you're dealing with, whether you've got an audiobook or a print book or whatnot. So really, if you need to keep 245 Subfield H, then you should go ahead and do that, and I wouldn't recommend removing it until you've worked out all of the possible confusion points that you're going to create for your users. But we do strongly recommend that you don't strip out the 3XX fields. Leave them in there, hide them from your public, so that when the functionality appears in your systems, you'll be able to use them, and you won't have to go back and try to recreate them. All right, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about those fields later on.
Okay, question number 7. What are the benefits of RDA to library customers? I'm primarily interested in how this will help our public library customers.
Okay, well, this comes back to, for me, the fact that we're still working in a MARC environment. And so we're adopting a new content standard, but we're straddling that with the old ways of doing things. So I don't think the benefits will be apparent until our library systems implement FRBR functionality and they come up with creative ways to work with the data elements that we're creating. We're really moving ahead with this new content standard before seeing it in action. But if we don't get started, we'll never get there. And I think about the 008 fields have been, you know, we've been carefully coding control fields like the 008, and they've sat there quietly in the background. And it's only recently, and you know, in our case, we're implementing a new discovery layer, and finally we're taking advantage of some of the data that's in those fields. So unfortunately, there are not very many great examples to show, and I think this is a problem, especially when we're trying to convince our administrators and our directors that this is a direction in which we need to go. But I am an optimist because there is a lot of work going on, and it's really early days yet. So I would say I agree that it's difficult to explain to our directors and to really understand how this is going to help our customers, but I believe it will in the long run, and we shouldn't let the lack of solid examples stop us, because those examples are coming soon. I really believe that. And I just want to, I think one of the great examples that I have heard is Karen Coyle. I'm sure a lot of you have heard Karen Coyle, and she talks at length about linked data and the possibilities therein. And she uses the example of Google Maps, which is a great example because it shows us instantly how they have taken data from different types of data and mashed them up. So, for example, I could do a search for Springfield, and then I can get directions from Toronto. which means the system has to know which Springfield I'm talking about. There's quite a few of them in the United States, and it also, I have to clarify that I'm talking about Toronto, Ontario. I'm not coming from Ohio. And then I can do a search. Once I've gotten my directions, I can do a search for all the yarn shops in Springfield, which is, you know, a key important part of all of my travels. So sometimes Google Maps gets some of the details wrong, or, you know, it's not exactly completely 100% accurate all the time, but we don't say scrap it until it's perfect. We say, let's keep going, let's move on. And I think there are so many questions and so many services that we could provide if we can open up our data and make it work in that way with other data on the web. The last thing I want to say about this is that in terms of looking at the future and the vision for the future and the idea that we would have records for works and they would be linked to records for expressions and they could be linked to records for manifestations. That poses a wonderful opportunity for catalogers to store accurate and full information about works and expressions that we will not have to recreate over and over and over again in our catalogs. The option to link to data that we trust rather than recreating it is going to save us a lot of time and effort, and in the end will allow us to create systems that are far more user-friendly and exciting for our users.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Trina?
Okay, this slide is just a short list of bullet points of the points that I made when I answered my transcription questions. So now we can move on to the next question.
Okay. Okay, we're going to be addressing the next category, which is description and authority control. And the first question is, what is the purpose of the 3XX fields? And Kathryn will be addressing this question.
Greetings, everyone. I'd like to start with just a brief summary about these 3XX fields for those of you that this is new information. These come from the MARC 21 format for bibliographic data. And first I'll cover sort of the brief descriptions of the three fields that I'll be addressing today. The 336 field for content type, the 337 for media type, and the 338 for carrier type. So essentially these three fields have been introduced. First of all, the 336 content type essentially expresses the form of communication through which a work is expressed. The media type is the device that's required to view or run or play a resource. And the 338 field is provided as the carrier type that helps describe the format of storage medium, the housing of a carrier, and it's always used in conjunction with the media type. What's nice about this field is that it enables far more specific description than we've previously been able to have before. So for the rest of this question, I will acknowledge the help of Bobby Bothman, who is the Electronic Access Catalog Librarian at Minnesota State University, Mankato. So essentially, these new MARC 3XX fields are the RDA equivalent of the new ISBD Area 0, content, form, and media type. This takes the place of the General Material Designation, GMD, in Area 1. This new area of bibliographic description takes the place of GMD in Area 1. So the idea here is to provide a more robust, multidimensional description of the resource than GMD has previously provided us. The GMD electronic resource, for example, is a catch-all for any kind of resource with an electronic carrier and does nothing to allow us to describe the resource itself. We know that an electronic resource can be monographic or serial in nature. It can be visual, it can be oral, it can be cartographic, it can be musical, and all of these fit within the GMD electronic resource. Part of these questions about the 3XX field asked a very specific question about a very good example, the playaway, which is a device that comes preloaded with digital files. It allows us to circulate a very small device with perhaps an audiobook on it. And it's a really nice example of how content, carrier, and medium terms of the 3X fields can benefit a description. So what's nice about the playaway and why it'll be part of, possibly the future of library services is that it just requires a set of earbuds. It's all ready to go and all ready to play. But for example, if we look at the playaway in terms of the GMD is electronic resource, essentially because it's an MP3 file. But these new tags, the 3X fields, provide us to describe the content as spoken word, the carrier as an audio media player, and the media as audio and computer. We can contrast this with a description of an audiobook on compact disc, where the content would be spoken word, the carrier would be an audio disc, and the medium would be audio. It may seem silly or kind of redundant or awkward at first, but using a controlled vocabulary like this can be very, very powerful and can allow a user to pre-select the medium, the audio on the carrier, for example, if they're specifically looking for audio discs. And we can't do that presently as easily with the terminology we now have because we don't use any controlled vocabulary in this area. So the terms sound disk, compact disc, audio sound disk are all in use as specific material designators. Now, on a side note, media catalogers may desire even more terms than RDA may currently provide. So there may be continuing frustrations with this. For example, only to describe the media of anything formerly called an electronic resource is computer, which is a very severe limitation within RDA, possibly very short-sighted, because we know the term computer itself is getting outdated as our digital media changes over time. And so RDA needs to at least allow the use of the term digital to describe a medium. But hopefully, this brief summary and the use of the RDA, the use of playaway as an RDA example will start to help you understand the purpose of these new fields. So we can proceed to the next question.
Okay, question number 2. How will RDA affect the way series are entered? Kathryn?
Oh, all right. And I'm going to give special thanks again to Bobby Boffman for a brief answer to this question. In terms of Mark 21, encoding the series is entered via transcription into field 490, following the RDA guidelines applicable to series title and numbering. Essentially, there's very little difference between RDA and AACR2 in this case. You transcribe the series title as you find it on the preferred source of information. The differences come in here. It would depend on your institution and the decision that they make as to whether or not to follow ISBD presentation or capitalization rules. Here, in this case, you would no longer abbreviate words like volume or band and would use Roman numerals if you find those on your source. So there's just a brief answer to that.
Okay, our next question. Please explain the cataloger's choice to list all creator access points or not when there are more than 3 creators. Is this a local and arbitrary choice? Are there best practices? And Erin will be addressing this question.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by running through the rules quickly. At RDA 18.3, for general guidelines and core elements for recording relationships between a resource and persons, families, and corporate bodies associated with that resource, we are told to create access points for creator. If there's more than one, only the creator having principal responsibility named first in the resources embodying the work or in reference sources is required. If principal responsibility is not indicated, only the first name creator is required. So it is true that the rule does not tell you how many authorized access points to include beyond the first required. Not more than 3, actually, beyond the first one. 2.4.1.4 for statement of responsibility says transcribe a statement of responsibility in the form in which it appears on the source of information, with 2.4.1.5 saying essentially to do the same in situations where there's more than one person named. There's also an optional omission here to constrain to the rule of 3. So a cataloger may transcribe all the authors in the statement of responsibility, but only give access points for the first, or the first and second or third, or the first and fifth and eighth, if they so choose. While I'm not in a position to speak directly to why the Joint Steering Committee left this to catalogers' judgment, I do have thoughts that I would like us to consider. Yes, this is a cataloging agency choice, and I imagine that best practices will develop for certain communities over time. And yes, catalogers' choice, and I think this is the crux of the question, catalogers' choice here will lead to inconsistency in our data. In actuality, however, our community has no real data-driven evidence as to whether consistency matters here or not. Catalogers' judgment is encouraged in RDA, grounded in the Ferber user tasks, and those are find, identify, select, and obtain. But we do not have solid research into where consistency in the choice of elements to record matters greatly or matters little in support of those user tasks. This fact seems to me to greatly inhibit our ability to determine where community best practice or policy needs to develop. This decision, one way or the other, feels arbitrary, indeed it does, because we do not really know what it means to support a user task. So in my opinion, we need more research here before we can determine with any kind of certainty whether we should undertake the additional work of routinely providing more authorized access points. Also, if we think about RDA testing leading us to new ways for extending and developing our cooperative cataloging infrastructure, where data is linked together and all relevant data elements need not be created at once at the point of initial creation, subsequent relationships could be added later by communities who find that data valuable down the pipeline. Thank you.
Okay, next question. What's new in authority control with RDA? Trina?
Okay, hello there again. I'm going to briefly touch on 4 things that I think are new with authority control. The first one is the functional requirements for authority data, also known as FRAD. FRAD is a new model developed to provide an understanding of what authority work really accomplishes. And as we've seen with FRBR, the new conceptual model for bibliographic data, it requires us to rethink the work that we're doing and why we're doing it, and to focus on user tasks. So I think, I'm not going to talk at length about FRAD, but I'd say FRAD is one new thing in authority control that we are going to have to get to know. Another thing that's new in authority control is that in RDA, fictitious entities and non-human entities can receive access points as creators and contributors. So we're going to see some interesting access points for Miss Piggy and maybe Winnie the Pooh and other kinds of characters that we didn't see access points before in the past, and that should be interesting. The third thing that's new in authority control are some new mark tags in the authority data records, like 336 for content type. This is the same element that's in bibliographic records, so you should know that it can also be used in name authority records for expressions. Oh, sorry, it just can be used in authority records for expressions. Other new tags include 370 for associated place, 371 for address, 375 for gender, and 377 for associated language. So there are some new mark tags that we're going to have to get to know if we are creating authority records, and that would be the third thing that was new. And finally, the fourth thing that I think is new and important to think about, and it's not necessarily connected to RDA, but it is new, and that's the Virtual International Authority File, VIAF.org, which is a database containing authority records from national libraries around the world. And this, I think, is a really exciting development, and it's going to further our ability to share our information and to stop reinventing work that's already been done, and to link to each other's work, and to provide for our users information about entities in the language that they prefer. That's a little bit down the road, but you know, we're getting started, and I think that's a really good thing. And so that segues nicely into the next question.
What is the rationale behind dismantling AACR2 forms of names, since this change does not seem to be mandated by FRBR or new formats being cataloged? Trina?
Okay, the 7XX forms in existing A2 records have been the topic of much discussion on lists lately. It's a little bit confusing. So I'll just remind you that during the test done by the Library of Congress and other libraries in the U.S., participants were allowed to test all the possibilities allowed by RDA for creating authorized access points. And this was considered important because this was a test, and they really wanted to test out the parameters and see where things went well and where they didn't. So I believe that that's where this question is coming from, the fact that we can have a 7XX in a record that is just a different form of the 1XX, the A2 form of the 1XX. So I asked Judy at the Library of Congress, and she was very kind to respond right away. And given that I'm not testing in the United States, I'm going to tell you what Judy said. And she said that if RDA is implemented by the PCC, the 7XX fields that have been added to the A2 authority records won't just automatically be flipped to 1XX fields. The differences between the 7XXs added to the existing A2 records will be evaluated, and people will, have a good look at them and determine, where are the possible RDA compatible access points and where are they not. Additionally, we expect that the PCC will create guidelines for the use of the separate fields, and so we hope to see that soon. And I hope that answers the question.
Okay, moving on to the third category, conflicts with existing guidelines. The first question is, I heard that RDA is incompatible with CONSER. What CONSER rules would have to change? The question goes to Linda.
Hi, everybody. Actually, it's really too soon to tell about changes both to CONSER and to the BibCo standard record. Right now, the CONSER and the PCC standard record already have some deviations from AACR2. So these are going to have to be looked at in the broader scheme. Specifically for CONSER records, there is some difference in the transcription of the title field, the statement of responsibility field, and also at this point CONSER has no guidelines at all for the addition of the 3.3x fields. So it really is going to be a matter of once RDA, if RDA is accepted, both CONSER, PCC, the BibCo standards are going to have to go back and look. So I'm afraid I can't give you a more explicit answer than that.
Okay, next question. I understand that RDA is incompatible with the single record approach and with the provider-neutral approach to e-resource cataloging. Is this correct? And the question goes to both Erin and Linda.
Erin, I'm going to let you go first.
Sorry. So in a truly FRBRized environment, which RDA presumes, there are separate descriptions for each of the separate manifestations associated with a work, all joined together by linking fields or ultimately URIs. And Trina did an excellent job of describing that in an earlier question. And this is why RDA is incompatible, sort of quote unquote, with the single record and provider neutral approaches. Each manifestation should have its unique manifestation level elements described separately and appropriately. But in reality, until we have a truly FRBRized cataloging infrastructure and toolset, we will likely continue to have workarounds to minimize the proliferation of records containing the same work and expression level data and the proliferation of labor to produce those records. One of the things that we learned here at NCSU as a testing participant is that RDA development is really only the beginning. We very much also need new infrastructures and tool sets. In the interim, I imagine that different institutions will continue to make different decisions in the context of their current metadata creation and delivery infrastructures, as we have been. Libraries have long been all over the board on preferences for single and separate records, and more recently around provider neutral. Apart from RDA, for example, NCSU has been actively moving away from the single record approach to separate records to facilitate mass record loading. So this was a non-issue for us re-RDA. We had, however, adopted and we're grateful for the provider-neutral guidelines. For the RDA test, we created provider-specific records for the common set because we were asked to by the coordinating committee, or the question didn't apply because the publisher was actually the same as the provider. But for our extra set records, we did opt for an RDA-ish, RDA-esque, but yet provider-neutral approach. We're committed to provider-neutral given the state of our metadata creation and discovery infrastructures in 2010-2011 during the test. So we'll have to see what happens as those evolve. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linda, who will talk about the bibliographic utilities.
This is Linda again, and basically Erin did cover what was going to happen in terms of the fact that this is going to be a practical approach by the libraries. We still have the same factors under RDA as we did have under AACR2 in terms of how we need to identify materials and also to be able to give libraries and their patrons a consolidated approach to finding the materials they have. So I really can't add any much more than that. So next question.
Okay, that moves us into the fourth category of testing and training. The first question is, what kind of training did you have on RDA during the testing period? The question goes to Erin and Kathryn.
So at midwinter 2010, Barbara Tillett and Judy Kuhagen from the Library of Congress led a day-long Train the Tester session, and our continuing and electronic resources librarian attended this session. This session, so you all know, was recorded, and it is freely available, broken out as modules on the Library of Congress website, and we recommend it. There are links. There'll be links at the end of these slides. The cataloging management team at NCSU also watched this webinar session together. We formed a training team here that was chaired by Christy Pascal, who's our associate head for metadata and cataloging, and they met weekly, or more often than weekly. They assembled available resources, largely from the Library of Congress, but also from other folks who were presenting around or creating documentation, Adam Schiff, the University of Chicago, etc. And I'm going to use Christy's phrase here, they learned and muddled through as a group, developing content while simultaneously learning the materials for themselves. There was a lot of muddling. They also worked through local policy decisions and looked at our choices vis-a-vis what the Library of Congress was putting out there or the direction that we were getting from OCLC, which, while daunting, is also a really excellent method of learning. You need to learn what you need to learn to set policy, make decisions, and communicate them to others. The training team developed a training curriculum for the NCSU catalogers, which started with Ferber and then covered the RDA content that was relevant to the NCSU collections. This was a 12-hour program over the course of 3 half-days, and we trained all of our catalogers simultaneously. We then divided into breakout groups where we did RDA cataloging together hands-on. All the staff went through single and multi-part monograph breakout groups, and then the serials staff did a serials exercise. The catalogers who catalog videos, a DVD exercise, etc. We'll have a slide at the end of the session, as I mentioned, with all the links, and all of the NCSU material is available for you to check out and use however you would like. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathryn.
All right, I'll offer our experience at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. We have a slightly different setup because we were running the test as a practicum. GISLIS was part of the Graduate Schools of Library and Information Science funnel group, which was a consortium of 15 educator groups at different educational institutions across the United States, formed largely through the efforts of Marjorie Bloss. The participants at our own site included 5 university library faculty who supervised the record production of practicum students. There were 8 master's and certificate of advanced study students, and then there were 3 library school faculty. My role, of course, was that of site coordinator, and the other 2 instructors, Cheryl Tarsella and Paul Weiss, were the chief RDA trainers and instructors for students and for their library faculty supervisors. Our students came to the practicum with a variety of cataloging experiences, anywhere from having absolutely no formal training and no coursework to several who had completed advanced cataloging coursework and on-the-job training as catalogers themselves. Because this was an RDA practicum, this experience was available to our distance students as well as our on-campus students. And one of the constraints of the practicum is that it involves 100 hours of work with the student working both under the close supervision of one library faculty member as well as one graduate school library faculty member. So we had two groups of students. Those with no formal training or experience were assigned to a group to produce RDA records encoded in Dublin Core. Those with at least one cataloging class produced both RDA and AACR2 records, and these were encoded in MARC. Training began as an online enterprise over the course of 8 weeks. Each of the sessions that we offered lasted for 1.5 hours and was recorded and archived for later reference. Readings and exercises were completed by the students. The total training time that everyone put in was 25 hours. But in addition, we found many of the students and the practicum supervisors, the library faculty, found it useful to supplement by following the discussions on RDA-L, on AutoCAT, and several of them attended the ALCTS RDA webinars that happened last year between September and ending in December. We found that some of the materials, including those produced by the trainers at the Library of Congress, were geared more towards practicing catalogers, and so our instructors found that they needed to adapt the material that was provided for training in the test. Essentially, these 8 modules broke out accordingly. Session 1 involved covering the foundations of RDA, the functional requirements of bibliographic records, and also having students review IFLA's 2009 Statement of the International Cataloging Principles. In Session 2, we moved to the RDA structure, and students were given students and supervisors were given a guided tour of the toolkit itself so they could get a better understanding of the internal structure of RDA. Essentially, we started with a table of contents that Paul Weiss created. In Session 3, we moved on to a more hands-on look at the RDA toolkit itself. Session 4 and Session 5, we took a close look at the description and representational structures available in RDA. And by Session 6, the students were ready to start thinking about how is it that you generate RDA metadata from a sample resource. Essentially, it was a walkthrough of what does it look like to use a workflow and to create a record. In Session 7, the students and the supervisors actually created a record after being instructed in the different kinds of changes they could anticipate from MARC 21 to RDA and used an official example. Session 8 was our concluding session, and all of the students came to campus. So this was our one session that was not online, and students were trained in how to use Connection to upload their records into OCLC Connection, and actually got to practice what it was like to take a record that they had created in RDA, to upload it through Connection, and then to answer the surveys. So that concluded our testing.
Okay, next question. What went well and what didn't go well with RDA testing in your institution? Again, Erin and Kathryn.
So at NCSU, what went well was tailoring the content to need to know. Our Ferber session was necessarily theoretical, but we aimed to keep everything as practical as we possibly could. We deliberately tailored the Ferber content to focus on the concepts needed to carry over to RDA training, and then we attempted to make those concepts concrete. We also focused on the Ferber tasks. For the RDA core training, we did not cover changes to types of materials we do not often collect. That includes parts of the Bibles, rare books, treaties, and music. And that might sound sacrilege or simply odd, as some of the most interesting RDA changes actually are in those areas. But truly, I feel the most important advice I can offer is don't get derailed by the edge cases, whatever those edge cases are for you. Train on what your catalogers actually catalog. It makes the endeavor significantly less overwhelming when you realize that there may be a bit you can peel away and the rest will come as needed over time. Another thing that went well was a decision to start with the harder stuff and leave on a high. This, of course, is opposite to most cataloging training where you need to build up, but we had experienced AACR2 catalogers. We wanted them dealing with the hard issues when they had full brain power at the beginning of the session. By day 3, we wanted everything that we covered to be less controversial and more welcome and more common sense. What worked less well? Staff really want examples, 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 examples. We learn by example. We did not have enough examples. We did not show full record examples, and we mostly had, what we had were mostly made up snippets. Often you need more context than you had, or a question that came up could not really be addressed appropriately because the examples were not for real life items. We used a lot of other people's examples, particularly the Library of Congress, and they were good, but they were not contextual to our environment. The University of Chicago did work up full record examples, which were fabulous, but they were also not contextual to our environment. This lack pursued us all during the course of testing. The examples in RDA Toolkit are very monographic centric, and they often cover the easier cases. They're not adequate in complex situations, so the community really needs to develop a body of examples. We also generally had issues with RDA Toolkit. You really need a good grasp of Ferber to even navigate the toolkit effectively. Our catalogers think in MARC, they do not think in Ferber. While the MARC to RDA mapping proved essential, it's not yet available through the search, though we hear that is coming. And it does reinforce an RDA in MARC approach that I don't actually think is good for us in the long run. But it will also be a long time before we think in Ferber, and we need pedagogically grounded tools to help us get there. And now I will turn it back over to Kathryn.
All right. And I can echo some of the same experiences that Erin had, even though we were a practicum at an educator's site. So what went well? I think on the whole, everyone was really excited to be part of the test. And when it was all said and done, half of the participants really liked the toolkit, although the other half thought that it needed substantial improvements. We've forwarded a whole raft of suggestions for improvements, including interface design, to ALA, and I see that they're slowly working through participant suggestions. But what everyone felt was one of the best features was the link back and forth between RDA and AACR2. It really helped with our training and the testing during the period, as well as the links between RDA and the Library of Congress policy statements. On the whole, I think our participants felt that RDA was a general improvement, but it just hasn't gone far enough. Half liked the workflows, but there was a delay in making them functional so that they weren't available until the last part of our training process. I'll echo what Erin has said about the importance of understanding Ferber. Because RDA is based on Ferber, the functional requirements for bibliographic records, concepts, instructions in RDA are organized around work, expression, manifestation, and item. They're not organized according to different types of resources. Anyone who wants to learn RDA has got to be especially familiar with Ferber. One of the things that our participants felt really good about the testing were these content type, carrier type, and media type linking fields that allow us to create links and records for related resources, allow more use of relationship designators. Essentially, this is a much more user-oriented approach that allows catalogers to take what they see and accept what they get. Definitely, these are steps towards making our bibliographic data more real and can be repurposed and acted upon in a wider world. But this leads into sort of what didn't go especially well. There were numerous delays with the publication of RDA, which meant that a lot of the people who wanted to be involved in this practicum weren't able to by the time it was published. The toolkit itself had a lot of lag time, which made it difficult both for training and for record production. And the workflow functionality is coming up to speed, and half of our participants feel that's actually one of the brilliant developments within RDA to allow people to create workflows to assist with cataloging in RDA. One of our greatest challenges, of course, was this disconnect between the supervisor and student expectations and the expectations of the instructors. The supervisors and the students wanted practical hands-on exercises from the beginning, just as Erin found at her site, and the instructors were trying very hard to get the students to understand very theoretical concepts like Ferber prior to the hands-on work. I think all of us at this webinar would also say that one of the difficult parts about the testing and for the future of RDA is that we really don't have very many real-life applications that let us see what these records look like. And so this was a part of the test that our site was unable to produce much data for. So I'll hand this over to the next question.
Okay, just a second. Oops, excuse me. Okay, question number 3. Who did you ask for help when you have questions and want to clarify some rules? Erin?
So some of us in the testing group asked each other, and this was hugely helpful. We were learning together. How do you interpret this? What do you do in this situation? So we definitely need to find ways to support each other. We also emailed LC Help for RDA, and there'll be a link for this at the end. This email address is available to everybody. It's not just for the testers. Judy Kuhagen at LC is at the end of that email address, and she was awesome, sheerly awesome, in responding to our questions. There's also the RDAL listserv. Despite the crazy high volume of AutoCAD, a lot of us feel anxious about posting to listservs. Everyone must know the answer to this and understand this rule. How am I missing? What am I missing? But really here we're all learning together. And except for those who are really closely involved in the development of RDA, there are no experts, and we're not used to that. Sometimes we'd throw something out and the answer would be, I don't know, let me know what you decide. Or we would respond the same way in response to somebody else's questions. I don't know, what are you going to do? I don't know, what are you going to do? So we also need to get better at not agonizing. Do your best to interpret the rule, make the decision, trust your judgment, and move on. I'll hand it back for the next question.
Okay. Question number 4. What are practical methods to start training for RDA if we are ever to implement the new cataloging methods? Kathryn.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is go to the next slide that Erin and a few other participants put together. Instead of giving you a series of next steps, what we'd like to do is give you sort of a brief manual of resources that we feel are really critical as you start to think about training your catalogers or your students in how to use RDA. We have a link to the Library of Congress website about the test, invaluable link to North Carolina State University's training and testing materials. I highly recommend the University of Chicago training and testing materials, this next link. We've also got a link to a PowerPoint from Adam Schiff talking about changes from AACR2 to RDA. It's a comparison of examples, because even at the educator sites we found that students who were familiar with AACR2 had an easier time grasping how to move around and begin to create records in RDA. Let's proceed to the next slide. There's also a link to a discussion of RDA and MARC, and actually 3 email addresses or listservs that let you get involved in the conversation. I'd like to echo Erin's suggestion that we really did ask each other. We asked each other questions on RDAL. We also asked each other questions on the educators list, that's EDUCAT. And we sent a lot of messages to LC Help for RDA. So I encourage you to get involved in the discussion, keep asking questions. I know there's a lot of frustration about RDA and training and the future of whatever the decision may be. But I think keeping the conversations going is critical, because that's the only way we can actually move all of this forward and hopefully get some answers.
Okay. Moving on to the 5th category, which is the future of RDA. First question, are the U.S. National Libraries and the RD testing libraries aware that there is a widespread opposition within the cataloging community to the implementation of RDA? Erin?
So while none of us on this panel represents the U.S. National Libraries, I do feel pretty comfortable saying that the U.S. National Libraries are aware and the testing libraries are aware that there is significant disagreement or opposition, you can choose your exact word, skepticism, ambivalence within the cataloging community. You will have seen that members of the Test Coordination Committee and many, if not most or all, of the test participants do subscribe to the listservs. We are reading and seriously weighing the various arguments, are part of the discussion as Kathryn just described. I can say for NCSU that we did not go into this lightly. We were also asked, given opposition, why adoption is still on track. We are currently still in the testing phase. I'm not sure that this is exactly the correct vocabulary, whether adoption is or is not still on track. An adoption decision by the U.S. National Library should be announced in time for ALA Annual. The goal of the test was to assure the operational, technical, and economic feasibility of RDA based on data, the records created during the test, and on the experience of those creating the test data, including time to learn, time to create, difficulty in using the RDA toolkit, understanding the rules, understanding or seeing the usability of the resulting records, etc. A large amount of data was created. There are over 7,000, almost 8,000 extra step MARC bibliographic records, over 10,000 authority records, and a smattering of non-MARC formats available on the LC RDA download site. Analysis of that data and the accompanying survey responses is currently underway. While there's been valid criticism of the test data, largely that it mostly demonstrates RDA trapped in MARC, decisions, in my opinion, should be based on evidence rather than on listserv debate, and so I'm pleased to see that that is happening. As I understand it, other countries internationally will make adoption decisions and or implementation decisions on their own timelines, but are looking first to see what the results show from the U.S. National Library's test. I'm ready for the next question.
Okay. Is there any chance that libraries could still be allowed to make AACR2 records instead of RDA records if they would rather do that? And Erin and Linda will be addressing this question.
So the word that jumps out to me in this question is allowed. Is there any chance that libraries would still be allowed? And this question was also asked on RDA-L just this morning. So I'm going to tackle this from a management angle, and then I'll turn it over to Linda, who again will talk about the perspective of a bibliographic utility. And Trina already stole my thunder, but I will say again, there are actually no cataloging police, as much as we all joke about that. The question is, who do you share your data with, and what obligations, contractual, communal, otherwise, do you have with them? And what are the costs to you, and what are the differentials as regards value to your users if you choose to make a separate implementation decision? There will be communities of practice, including LC, PCC, OCLC, that will make statements for their environments and their catalogers. But it is hard, if not impossible, for me to imagine that everyone would convert at the same time, even if we could account for who everyone in the cataloging ecosystem was. So at midwinter, Beecher Wiggins from LC was saying that we now live in a universe of mixed standards. We need to deal with records of all types. Certain entities are likely to create AACR2 even if RDA is adopted in the US, as well as others creating RDA even if it is not adopted in the US. At NCSU, while we'll have a decision on our original cataloging, we plan to expect and accept full-level copy regardless of whether it is AACR2 or RDA for any foreseeable future. Catalogers should follow the guidance of their leadership in their communities in which they belong and should expect to ingest records and manage data which follow both standards. Now I turn it to Linda.
Linda?
Sorry, it was my turn to forget to unmute. I said Erin just did a wonderful job of stealing my thunder as well. The points that she made are excellent, and it really boils down to, are you in a shared environment? If you are in a consortial, OPAC, or if you're sharing with a bibliographic utility, the records themselves probably could live independently. Where you're going to have problems are with the headings. That's where you don't want to have conflict. And in any case, you may still be able to choose to do local editing, but that's going to be a question of how much time and staff do you want to spend on tweaking records that are in many cases perfectly fine. So the bibliographic patrol may not become knocking at your door, but you do have to take note of what the implications will be if you are in a shared environment. Next question.
Question number 3. How will RDA facilitate linked open data functionality? Erin and Kathryn.
So this question is much larger that can be answered well here, but broadly and briefly and without any technical detail at all, I will say that I see RDA moving forward the possibility of library linked data in 2 very important ways. The first is that while RDA is not perfect, it may not immediately meet all these goals in all ways. It is made up of discrete elements and moves us from thinking about what we are creating ultimately as records to points of data or assertions or statements that can be used, shared, mashed up, and discovered in unimagined ways on the open web. The work of Diane Hillman and Karen Coyle in the Metadata Registry with their efforts to assign URIs to RDA elements and make the vocabularies exist within a modern true web infrastructure is hugely important. On RDAL this week particularly, you can see that work happening before your eyes. Second, with a focus on encoding relationships, RDA brings our attention to the potential of a new generation of information discovery tools that could truly guide users through a network of related resources. Some of those relationships can be encoded in automated ways, and we can begin to see how we can make the creation of these relationships cheaper. Others require human interpretation, which is the value that us human catalogers bring to this enterprise. We talk a lot about the value of browse. We should be helping people to browse a collection of resources, not a list of authorized headings. From a management perspective, RDA gives us more readily the freedom to accept more descriptive and transcriptive data from the original source, or from secondary sources like vendors, and focus my primary finite human dollars on building a network of relationships that will get a user from the known to the unknown, and that linking out to external data hubs will get users to resources that the original cataloger was not at all aware of or could not even begin to imagine at the time of data creation. RDA may have issues in the technical facilitation of linked data functionality as it needs to operate on the open web, and we saw clearly from the tests that we cannot encode many of these relationships in MARC in any useful way. But RDA is changing our thinking in ways that I believe will facilitate our move culturally as a community beyond the library data silo. And to me, that's equally important. RDA is not the end, it's only the start, and we must channel the momentum. And now we'll give it back to Kathryn.
All right. In the interest of time, I will just thank you, Erin. That was a magnificent summary. I think that it's going to be really difficult for us to see how RDA will facilitate linked open data functionality until we have new systems that support this new way of cataloging and user interfaces. So I'd like to proceed to the vendors discussion.
Okay, we're going to start Category 6, but let me make an announcement that we are getting close to running out of time. However, we are going to finish the webinar, and for those that have to leave, we're sorry, but you can still have access to the recording once it's posted to the ALCTS website. Now let's return to Category 6 and with the vendors, and the first question is, what questions should we be covering with our ILS vendors? What do they need to do to accommodate or take advantage of RDA? Linda?
You've probably gotten some great ideas as you've listened to this presentation. The first thing I would ask your vendor is, can they handle the new MARC fields that went in with the MARC updates? Next, you may want to ask, how are they going to handle the 33X fields in terms of public display? Are they going to show the fields themselves, or will they be taking a more graphical access point to that? Do they have any plans for a cataloger interface that will allow the cataloger to create the records without actually knowing the MARC code, to use more of the drop-down so that behind the scenes will do the heavy lifting? Has your ILS considered doing more with the Ferber work sets and Ferber manifestations so that they can do more grouping? Another thing you may want to ask is, new with this MARC update was the concept of linked authority fields, so that text does not have to be keyed in, but rather links to the authority records themselves. And finally, but not last, have they made provisions for indexing changes, or is this something that you will have to take care of in your own local system? So let's move on to the next one.
Okay, question number 2. What is known about vendor plans to implement RDA? And the question goes to Kathryn.
All right, for this question, I put out as many queries as I could to people with vendor contacts, and I got a response back from Chris Oliver, who is a cataloger at McGill, who's essentially reporting back from the recent Amigos webinar. So her take on this is that as we talk about what the plans are to implement RDA, her reflection is that she's hoping that I mean beyond shoehorning RDA into MARC 21. She feels like this is a great analogy because in terms of really all of the vendors that we're aware of, there aren't any taking a much longer view besides this, shoehorning RDA into MARC 21. But she reports theoretically that Ex Libris is thinking about Ferber and RDA as they develop their new URM, that's a Unified Resource Management System, but she doesn't know any there were no details reported about that. The VTLS, of course, is the most advanced ILS in terms of working with RDA. It's looking a lot more polished. It now provides links to the RDA toolkit within their software. Innovative Interfaces is planning to make the new MARC fields valid, and they are providing some brief documentation about indexing and displaying these new fields, but say they're, quote, actively reviewing development possibilities. Probably the most news that I could give you comes from Galen Charlton, who's the Vice President for Data Services at Equinox Software. Yet he himself is working with these new 336, 337, 338 fields in COA and in Evergreen, trying to find good ways to use the data for displays, for indexing. He's especially encouraged by Extensible Catalog's Metadata Services Toolkit that looks to be a pretty promising place for experimentation. And I think all of us would really like to see a chance to have a sandbox to play with RDA data in new ways. I know VTLS was offering this service briefly during the testing period so that we can get a better sense of how we can use this new data from RDA that the developers envisioned in more of a real-life environment. So I'll pass it to the next question.
Okay. Question number 3. What are OCLC's plans to support RDA? And the question goes to Linda.
Could we go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
The first thing we want to do is we currently have over 12,000 records in the OCLC database. And we had implemented a policy during the test period which basically said that if you find a record in the database, please use it. Do not change it just for the sake of upgrading it to RDA records, RDA rules. When the decision is made by the National Coordinating Committee, we will obviously have to re-examine that policy. At this point, we do not state that you must use RDA. We ask that you may enter RDA records if you are familiar with the standard. The next area that we are going to be working with are the connection cataloging interfaces. With the next client interface that will be coming out in the next 2 months or so, we will offer links to the RDA toolkit if the library already has a subscription to RDA. It will not require a separate login to move back and forth between connection and RDA toolkit. We're also looking at what kinds of changes are needed for work forms and macros. We do have a macro that we created as part of the test that prompted librarians in the construction of the 3.3x fields. We will make that macro more available on a more wide basis. At this point, we are not making any changes to the work form for creating of new records. That will wait until we have a decision about implementation. The last point I wanted to mention is our systematic evaluation and matching. We load records not only from people keying records in directly, but also from batch loading from a variety of sources. And we need to do an evaluation to make sure that when a record comes in that is RDA and it is for the same information that is for an existing AACR2 record, we need to know that we can reliably tell whether it is for the same resource or not, and then match. We do want to keep duplicates to a manageable level. And I know I hear people laughing in the background on that statement. But we do want to make sure that we are being consistent and accurate in our matching algorithms. So this is something that will be moving forward. Our policy always has been that you do not create a new record just for a change in cataloging rules. And we do ask that people follow that policy. If you have a record that is currently less than full, you may upgrade that to a full and change the cataloging rules in the meantime. And I think I'll end at that point. If there are questions that come in via chat, we can answer those in greater detail later.
Okay, question number 4. Will OCLC continue to support AACR2 cataloging? Linda?
As you've heard before, we are in an environment of mixed rules. So records are coming in with pre-A2 headings, pre-A2 records, A2 records, and RDA records. We will continue to support that, but we cannot guarantee that the A2 records will not be merged to RDA or RDA records merged to ACR2. Remember that libraries can always edit the records to their own local standards. And I think that will be the end of that question.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Okay, finally we're at category number 7 about the RDA toolkit. And for this last category, there was a few questions submitted from the survey regarding the development of future chapters and the RDA toolkit pricing that the experts were not comfortable addressing since they don't represent ALA or the Joint Steering Committee for the development of RDA. So they have provided the web addresses as noted on the screen to ALA's FAQ about the RDA toolkit and to the Joint Steering Committee's FAQs on the development of RDAs. This brings us to the end of the questions, and I'd like to thank the experts for their insightful program that has provided us with a better understanding on RDA. We hope you found today's webinar useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS Committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. Just a reminder, once again, this session has been recorded and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the experts' PowerPoint slides. And for those of you who submitted additional questions, thank you. Please check the ALCTS Committee website in the near future to answer your questions. And just for your convenience, I've noted some upcoming webinars regarding RDA. On March 2nd, there'll be a program on RDA and serials catalogers. Will our work really change? On March 16th, we have linked library data, tuning library metadata for the semantic web. And April 6th, preparing copy catalogers for RDA. Thank you again for joining us. And if you have further information about our ALCTS webinars, please go to the ALCTS homepage and web address given here on the slides. New webinars and e-forums and CE events are continually being developed, so check that website for new information. Before we close today, I would also like to especially thank Felicia D. Dykes for providing technical support for today's webinar. She and her colleagues on the CE Committee Technical Support Subcommittee make it possible to present these webinars smoothly. We sincerely appreciate your attendance today and hope you will join us again for another presentation from ALCTS. Thank you very much.